Pokemon games aren't supposed to have good stories. Every Pokemon game since the dawn of time has had either no story or a really, really bad one. It's practically written into Game Freak's contract with the Pokemon Company. Pokemon games aren't allowed to be narratively interesting. And I thought that this was going to be the case again when I started playing Violet, where the players first met with Nemona's oppressive battling fetish, and then right after that with Arven's quest to make the ultimate Pokemon sandwich. These both sound exactly like the kind of inane, soul-crushing nonsense we've all come to expect from this godforsaken children's franchise. But then the game had the audacity to betray this time-honored tradition and went ahead and made a good story. Not for a Pokemon game, not even just for a video game. An emotional, engaging, empowering, actually good story. And that happens, surprisingly enough, with Arven's arc. Once you actually get into his quest, you find out that the main super genius professor in this game is actually his parent. It turns out that for as smart and famous as the professor is, they're actually a really terrible parent, because in their obsession with their inventions and research, they end up completely neglecting Arven. As a result, he has very few memories of his parent aside from occasionally helping them with their research, and his only companion growing up was his dog. At some point, shortly before you meet Arven in the game, the professor asks them to go to a really dangerous part of the region to help them with their research. During this mission, Arven ends up getting attacked by a really strong Pokemon, and is only able to survive because his dog nearly sacrifices itself to protect him. Arven then tried to heal his dog, but realized that it needed medical attention that just wasn't possible with modern technology. So when you meet him, you find him at the peak of his desperation as he resorts to believing in myths of mystical herbs that may not even exist so he can have some hope of saving his dog. This is a surprisingly impressive backstory. It's multi-layered and complex in a really interesting and human way. The surface layer is just that Arven wants to save his dog, which in itself is a perfectly reasonable goal. But beneath that is the desperation for Arven to not lose the closest thing he had to a caretaker and friend growing up, adding an extra layer of urgency and importance to the quest. And below all of that is the deep anger Arven has towards the professor for not only using the research as an excuse for neglecting him his entire life, but also then putting the one thing that gave Arven some sense of stability at extreme risk, once again for the sake of the professor's research. Arven is not only fighting to save his best friend, he's fighting to prevent the professor's research from continuing to ruin his life and everything he cares about. That in itself is incredible coming from a Pokemon game. And not only that, but for once there's no world-ending mythology come-to-life nonsense you need to stop, or one-dimensional villains with stupid outfits and stupid hair and stupid logic that you need to beat. It's just a human being with human problems who needs your help. But what really elevates the story is how it fully utilizes its medium, namely being a video game, to hammer home its themes. As I mentioned earlier, Arven is looking for a set of mystical herbs that can save his dog. Each herb grows in a different part of the world and is protected by a giant souped-up boss Pokemon. Arven asks for the player's help because he doesn't feel confident in himself to be able to overcome these Pokemon alone and needs you to essentially take them down for him. But what's great about this is that he actually still joins you in these fights, even if he's not always sure that he can contribute. But you see him slowly get stronger with each battle, and by the end, for a lot of players, he even ends up carrying you against the final strongest Guardian. This was such a great way to make Arven's story so much more personal for players. For one thing, the fact that Arven actively helps you and isn't just a deadweight side character who shows up exclusively in cutscenes makes him more of a real person and friend to the player, because they're actually involved during gameplay, doing things with the player like an actual friend would. For another, the gameplay mirrors Arven's own growth as he learns to believe in himself and rise out of his parents' shadow. You see him take real pride in being able to fulfill a quest that he wasn't even sure was possible to do, and view himself as capable and worthy despite not being the same level of researcher or inventor that his parent is. All of this culminates after he rescues his dog and challenges you to a final battle. In this battle, Arven ends up being one of the strongest characters in the game, showing how much he's grown throughout your journey thanks to your support, and the battle itself is symbolic of how Arven is ready to face his challenges alone, believing in his ability to succeed even without your help. It's an incredibly powerful and rewarding ending to this arc. And somehow, there's still more. After you complete the other two main quest lines in the game, the professor reaches out to Arven and the player and asks for help finishing the task that Arven failed to complete alone before, as in the one that almost killed him and his Pokemon earlier. Arven is obviously furious at first with his parents' awful request, but the professor insists, and since Arven's way stronger than he was before and now has you for backup, he agrees, and together you go into the crater in the middle of the region to complete the game's final quest and face Arven's demons head-on. When you get to the bottom of the crater and find the lab, everything starts to get kind of crazy while also somehow explaining everything that's happened so far. It turns out that the professor actually died almost 10 years ago, which is partly why they stopped seeing Arven. The professor you've been talking to is actually a robot built by the human professor in their image, who is tied to the professor's lab at the bottom of the crater and, more importantly, is in charge of the professor's magnum opus invention. Before they died, the human professor built a time machine that they were using to bring Pokemon from different timelines into the present. However, one of these Pokemon killed the human professor, which led to the robot professor deciding it was time to shut down the time machine and prevent more of them from coming in. Unfortunately, the human professor built in a defense system into the robot and made it so that it isn't actually capable of shutting down the time machine unless it's beaten in a battle. As a part of this, the robot professor gets some of the strongest Pokemon in the world to fight with, and the robot professor didn't want to put anyone in danger, so it sort of just sat around for a decade waiting for someone to get strong enough to beat it. That someone ends up being you. And that sets the stage for what is hands down the best and most satisfying final boss in a Pokemon game ever. After you beat it, the robot professor realizes that the only way to stop the time machine is for the robot to stop existing in this timeline. But as the time machine fires up, the robot professor momentarily seems to become the original human professor, and it tells a very distressed Arven how proud it is of him and how sorry it is for not being there for him. Then it gets transported away. Once again, the game somehow manages to create an incredibly complex emotional situation for Arven to work through. Does he forgive his parent for not being able to spend time with him because they were literally dead? Or is he even angrier that they were so reckless with their research that they got themselves killed and robbed him of his childhood? Should he be angry with himself for not being strong enough to get down to the research lab sooner? Or is that an unreasonable expectation to have for a child? Would it have even mattered spending time with a watered-down copy of his parent? Or would it have still been better than nothing? And what does he even do with himself now, knowing he's lost his parent forever twice and will never get closure? But for as interesting as all these questions are, the game doesn't really answer any of them. It offers a sort of flaccid response in the form of a final cutscene showing that regardless of his biological family, Arven has a reasonable found family that cares about him, even if they're not very respectful or thoughtful of his feelings. And then the game ends. And so we're left to grapple with these questions ourselves, to reflect on how we might respond in a similar situation. How do you handle a loved one leaving you forever by getting teleported into the future, or even just abruptly dying in an accident? How do you resolve the emotional scars you're left with? Who do you turn to for support in your lowest moments, and how do you protect them in return? And above all, how do you reconcile the fact that a story this unbelievably good came from a fucking Pokemon game? I mean, you can't be serious. Where on earth did this come from? How did the team that wrote Nemona's soggy vegetable of a storyline also write this fucking masterpiece? This is like a monkey writing Shakespeare.